January 19th, 1884. Ash Hollow Bend woke beneath a gentle winter sun. After weeks of bitter cold, the change felt almost miraculous. Frost loosened its grip on fence posts. Farmers stepped into their fields without pulling scarves over their mouths. Women opened windows for the first time in days and let fresh air sweep through their homes. Children walked toward the schoolhouse in lighter coats, laughing at a winter that suddenly seemed tired. The prairie appeared to exhale. Far to the northwest, however, Silas Rourke stood on the rise above his grass fortress and watched something no one else seemed to notice. A dark blue line, thin, low, almost invisible against the horizon. He did not study the fields. He did not watch the road. He watched the sky, and the longer he looked, the less he trusted the warmth of that morning. His trust lay not in the weather, but in what stood solid beneath his feet. The structure stood alone on the highest rise north of Ash Hollow Bend. Its walls were built from thick prairie sod. Its roof sat low against the wind, long, broad, heavy enough to look less like a home and more like a piece of the earth itself. Most people in town had stopped calling it a house months ago. They called it Rourke's Grave. The name traveled through feed stores, church gatherings, and wagon yards with the ease of a familiar joke. At the doorway, Mara Rourke watched her husband studying the distant horizon. She followed his gaze but saw only winter sunlight. Nearby, 12-year-old Eli carried a bucket toward the well. 9-year-old Anna sorted bundles of dry grass beside the wall. Neither child seemed aware that anything was wrong. For several moments, Silas said nothing. Then he finally turned from the sky. "Bring the children close today." Mara looked at him carefully. He offered no explanation. That was unusual enough to make her uneasy. Silas was not a man who frightened easily, and he was not a man who wasted words. The sight of that blue line pulled Silas back to a lesson learned long before Ash Hollow Bend existed. He had been 16 then, growing up in the Nebraska sandhills. The storm arrived without warning. One moment there had been sky. The next there was only white. Wind drove snow across the prairie so hard it felt like handfuls of sand striking bare skin. The world disappeared. Land, horizon, direction, everything vanished. Young Silas walked for nearly an hour, believing he was heading toward home. He was not. The cold itself was painful, but something else frightened him more. His body kept moving. His heat did not. Each gust carried it away faster than he could replace it. By the time his legs began to fail, an old cattleman spotted him through the blowing snow and dragged him into a half-buried hay shed built into a hillside. Inside, the air felt strangely still. The old man fed a few sticks into a small stove and waited. Hours later, when the storm finally loosened its grip, he pointed toward the thick walls packed with hay and earth. "The cold ain't what hunts people," he said. His weathered finger tapped the wall. "The movement does." Silas never forgot the lesson. Temperature could hurt a man. Moving air could kill him. That memory became the foundation for everything he built. 5 years earlier, when settlers were spreading across that section of Nebraska territory, most families searched for the same thing. Flat ground, easy ground, ground that looked simple to build on. Silas Rourke chose the piece nobody wanted, a low rise overlooking the surrounding prairie. The climb was inconvenient. Wagons worked harder reaching it. Hauling water required more effort. Even friends questioned the decision. Silas listened to them while driving survey stakes into the frozen soil. Then he pointed toward a shallow drainage cut winding across the grasslands below. Spring floods always followed that path. Winter drifts gathered there too. "The water knows where to go," he said. A few moments later he turned toward the open prairie where the prevailing winter winds crossed the land. The wind does too. Most men saw empty ground. Silas saw movement in the water, the snow, and the wind, and all three preferred the low places. So while others settled in the easy ground, he began building on the hill. The choice looked stubborn at the time. Years later, people would remember it differently. Construction began in the spring of 1879. From a distance, the work looked absurd. Silas was not raising a neat wooden homestead like everyone else. He was cutting the prairie itself into blocks and stacking the earth back on top of itself. Each sod block came out in long rectangles, dense with roots, heavy with packed soil. Some weighed nearly as much as a sack of grain. The foundation walls grew slowly, 42 inches thick at the base, 30 inches thick higher up. The dimensions sounded excessive. That became part of the problem. People noticed. Dusty, the old dun mule, hauled load after load from dawn until sunset. The animal climbed the hill so often that narrow tracks formed across the grass before summer arrived. Nearby, Eli patiently carried water from the creek in wooden buckets suited to his size. The repetitive work built calluses on his hands, and by evening his shoulders were heavy with fatigue, but he rarely complained. Anna followed behind, gathering prairie grass and stacking it into neat bundles beside the work area. Though she was too small for the heavy lifting, she constantly contributed with quiet, steady hard work. Mara mixed clay slip in a shallow pit lined with boards. Clay, water, chopped grass, again and again. The mixture stained her sleeves and dried beneath her fingernails. Some days, she spent more hours mixing than speaking. The hill became a place of repetition. Cut, lift, carry, stack, pack, repeat, week after week, month after month. By midsummer, travelers slowed their wagons just to stare. By autumn, people began making special trips to see it. Some stood quietly, others laughed. Most could not understand why any man would work so hard to build walls thick enough for a fortress. Silas never offered long explanations. He kept cutting sod. Eli kept carrying water. Anna kept gathering grass. Mara kept mixing clay. And little by little, the structure people would someday call Rourke's grave rose from the prairie hillside. It did not look impressive yet. It looked stubborn. Sometimes, on the frontier, that was the first sign that something important was being built. The first serious problem arrived the following spring. Not from wind, not from cold, from rain. 3 days of steady weather soaked the eastern side of the unfinished structure. Water found weaknesses hidden inside the wall. By the fourth morning, a narrow crack appeared near the base. By afternoon, part of the section had settled. Then it collapsed. Not completely, but enough for word to spread across Ash Hollow Bend before sunset. Caleb Voss, the merchant who supplied much of the settlement on credit, was standing outside his store when the news arrived. He laughed so hard that several men joined him before they even knew the full story. "The grave's sinking before they bury him in it," he announced. The joke traveled faster than any wagon. For several days, settlers rode out to see the damage themselves. Some looked satisfied, others looked relieved. Failure made more sense to them than success. When Silas reached the damaged section, he studied it for nearly an hour without speaking. The crack told a story. The wall had weight and strength, but it lacked enough internal structure to spread moisture and pressure evenly. He did not blame the weather. He blamed the design. The next morning, he began tearing the section apart. Block by block, layer by layer, people expected arguments, excuses, anger. Instead, they watched him dismantle weeks of labor with the same calm determination he had used to build it. Then he started over. This time, woven willow brush ran through the interior of the wall like a hidden skeleton. The clay packed tighter. The layers locked together differently. The repair took nearly a month. When it was finished, the crack was gone. So was any illusion that Silas possessed perfect answers. He was not a genius building without mistakes. He was a builder willing to face them. And on the frontier, that was often the more valuable skill. The repaired wall stood straighter than before. That did not stop the laughter. One Saturday afternoon, Caleb Voss leaned against the counter of his general store while farmers gathered around the stove to escape the wind. Business was slow, coffee was hot. Someone mentioned Silas's hilltop project. Caleb smiled. That usually meant trouble for somebody. "Rourke ain't building a house," he said. Several heads turned. "He's building a grave before winter does it for him." The room erupted. A few men laughed into their cups. Others slapped their knees. Even those who said nothing carried the joke home. By the end of the week, the name had spread across Ash Hollow Bend, Rourke's grave. The words followed the family everywhere. And the more the walls grew, the more the joke seemed to grow with them. Mayor Amos Treadwell, a man who valued appearances almost as much as votes, questioned the project openly. "A man expecting neighbors should build a home," he remarked during a town gathering, "not a fortress." Meanwhile, Caleb's wife, Elspeth Voss, found quieter ways to make her opinions known. Invitations reached nearly every woman in Ash Hollow Bend, but rarely reached Mara. Even the children felt it. One afternoon, Eli passed a group of boys near the schoolyard. "How's the grave coming?" one shouted. Another asked whether his family planned to bury themselves before winter arrived. The laughter followed him all the way home. Anna heard every word. That evening, the family ate supper in near silence. Nobody complained. Nobody argued. After the meal, Eli walked outside. The unfinished wall waited beneath the fading light. He picked up a single sod block, carried it across the site, and set it carefully into place. Silas watched from a distance. He said nothing. Neither did Eli. The wall grew 1 block higher before darkness covered the hill. Not everyone in Ash Hollow Bend mocked the fortress. One man simply disagreed with it. His name was Gideon Marr, an aging mason who had spent 3 decades building cellars, chimneys, smokehouses, and stone foundations across the territory. He was known for 2 things: solid work and an unwillingness to flatter anyone. Late one afternoon, Gideon rode out to the hill and tied his horse near the unfinished structure. He spent nearly 20 minutes walking around the walls without speaking. Silas continued working. Eventually, Gideon stopped beside the eastern side of the fortress. "The wall's too clever," he said. Silas looked up. That was not the criticism he expected. Gideon tapped the outer layer of sod with his knuckles. "You've got two barriers instead of one." Silas nodded. "Air gap between them. That's what worries me." For the next several minutes, the older builder explained his concerns. Moisture could become trapped inside the structure. Condensation could collect where nobody could see it. Rot could begin inside the walls long before it appeared on the surface. The roof worried him even more. Too much trapped moisture beneath winter snow. Too little ventilation. A few bad seasons could turn strong timber soft. "A house doesn't always fail where a man can see it," Gideon said. "Sometimes it fails where he can't." It was a fair argument. The kind that came from experience rather than pride. Silas listened carefully. When Gideon finished, the prairie fell quiet again. Finally, Silas pointed toward a narrow opening beneath the roofline, then toward another near the opposite end of the structure. "Small ventilation channels. Easy to miss. Air moves through there," he said. Gideon studied them. Silas continued. "Slow enough to keep the heat, fast enough to carry the moisture." The older mason remained silent. Neither man convinced the other that day. They simply stood beside the unfinished fortress, studying wood, earth, wind, and weather. Two builders, one believing the design would eventually prove itself, the other believing nature would eventually expose its weakness. Only time could decide which man was right. Night settled quietly over the hill. The wind had eased. The work site stood dark except for a single oil lamp glowing through the unfinished fortress. Inside, Mara sat at a rough table with a small notebook open beside her. Most settlers kept ledgers for seed, livestock, or debts. Mara kept one for weather, temperature, wind direction, fuel burned. The entries were short, practical, easy to overlook. Yet month after month, the notebook continued to fill. Across the room, Eli had fallen asleep beside a stack of tools he had forgotten to put away. One hand still rested on a wooden bucket handle. Anna slept beneath a blanket near the stove, curled tightly against the cold that leaked through the unfinished structure. For a while, only the scratching of Mara's pencil disturbed the silence. Then she looked up. "If you're wrong," she asked quietly, "what do we lose?" The question lingered between them, not because she doubted him, because she understood what was being risked. Years of labor and savings, years of carrying water, cutting sod, hauling timber, mixing clay, and building something no one else believed in. Silas did not answer immediately. His eyes moved toward Eli and Anna. The lamp cast long shadows across the room. Finally, he spoke. Everything. No explanation followed. No attempt to soften the truth. Mara lowered her eyes to the notebook. Silas rose from the table, added another piece of timber to the pile waiting beside the wall, then returned to work beneath the lamp. The fortress was not finished, and neither, it seemed, was the risk. By the autumn of 1882, the work was finally finished. What stood on the hill no longer resembled a construction site. It looked permanent. The outer walls rose from thick prairie sod cut and stacked over years of labor. Inside them stood a second barrier. Between the two ran a narrow buffer passage designed to slow the movement of winter air before it could reach the living quarters. Beneath the structure, an 8-foot root cellar disappeared into the earth. Potatoes, turnips, dried beans, barrels of preserved food, everything a family might need when roads vanished beneath snow. Along the southern side sat a low livestock shelter attached to the main structure. The design was simple. Animals produced heat. Heat was valuable. Silas saw no reason to waste it. Above everything rested a roof layered with rye straw and buffalo grass. Thick enough to insulate. Light enough to shed water. The fortress did not look elegant. It looked prepared. A few days after completion, Silas arranged a small test, not for the town, for himself. As dusk settled across the prairie, several oil lamps were placed near different corners of the structure. Gideon Marr arrived shortly before sunset. The old mason said little, he simply watched. Silas lit the lamp, then waited. Thin streams of smoke rose from the flames. Inside most frontier houses, moving air would have pushed those trails toward cracks, seams, doors, or poorly fitted windows. Not here. The smoke barely drifted. It climbed upward and hung almost motionless in the still air. One lamp, then another. The result remained the same. No wandering trails searching for escape. The warmth stayed where it belonged. For the first time since questioning the design, Gideon said nothing at all. He moved slowly through the room, studying the walls, the vents, the roofline, and the silent smoke. Outside, the prairie wind continued its endless search for a way inside. Inside, the air hardly moved, and that small difference meant everything. Winter arrived early that year. Each morning, Mara added another line to her notebook. Outside temperature. Inside temperature. Wood burned during the previous 24 hours. Nothing more, nothing less. The entries accumulated quietly while snow drifted against fences and frost climbed across window glass throughout Ash Hollow Bend. Then a pattern emerged. The numbers refused to behave the way people expected. While neighboring families hauled wagon loads of fuel through the season, the Rourkes consumed far less. Week after week, their woodpile shrank at nearly half the rate of many homes in town. Mara checked the figures twice, then 3 times. The result never changed. When Gideon Marr visited during a cold spell in January, she handed him the notebook. The old mason studied every page carefully. He compared temperatures, checked dates, examined fuel records. Several minutes passed. Finally, he closed the ledger and looked toward the fortress walls. For once, he offered no criticism. The numbers had done something, arguments could not. They had begun to speak for themselves. And the prairie, as always, was listening. The winter of 1882 to 1883 arrived with little warning and no mercy. The first storms came early. The cold stayed. Then it stayed longer. Week after week, the prairie disappeared beneath hard snow and bitter wind. Roads became difficult to follow. Water troughs froze solid overnight. Every trip outdoors became a calculation. Across Ash Hollow Bend, woodpiles began shrinking faster than expected. Families burned whatever they could spare. Extra chairs disappeared into stoves. Broken wagon boards became fuel. Fence rails that had taken years to set in place vanished one section at a time. The cold turned useful things into firewood. Every morning revealed another gap in another fence line. Another stack of lumber gone. Another family wondering whether their supply would last until spring. Yet on the hill, conditions looked strangely different. The fires inside the grass fortress never roared. They did not need to. Small, steady burns carried the structure through the worst days. The thick sod walls absorbed warmth and released it slowly. The buffer passage trapped drafts before they reached the living quarters. The root cellar remained above freezing despite the frozen earth outside. Eli still carried wood. Anna still helped sort supplies. Mara still updated her notebook each evening. Life was not comfortable. Frontier winters never were, but it remained manageable. The difference became difficult to ignore. Visitors noticed it first, then Gideon, then the town. Yet few people changed their minds. Most settlers explained the results away. Perhaps the winter was not as severe on the hill. The fortress benefited from unusual luck, and the next winter would expose its weaknesses. Those explanations felt easier than admitting the possibility that Silas had seen something they had missed. The evidence sat in plain sight. The walls worked. The fuel lasted longer. The family remained warm. Still, Ash Hollow Bend preferred a comfortable explanation over an uncomfortable lesson, and so the prairie delivered a small vindication. The larger one would have to wait. Spring arrived, the way it often did on the frontier, slowly at first. Then all at once, snow retreated into low places. Mud replaced ice. Wagon wheels began moving again. The prairie softened beneath warmer sunlight. And, as always, people started forgetting. The winter that had emptied woodpiles and consumed fence rails became a story instead of a warning. Across Ash Hollow Bend, repairs began immediately. New houses rose where old ones had struggled. Thin walls, shallow foundations, the same designs, the same assumptions and confidence. Caleb Voss seemed especially encouraged by the arrival of warmer weather. The grave survived one winter, he joked outside his store. Maybe next year it'll learn how to grow crops. The laughter returned almost as quickly as the robins. Silas heard some of it. He never answered. While the town celebrated surviving another season, he continued preparing for the next one. The root cellar was expanded several feet farther into the hillside. Additional shelves appeared along the walls. More potatoes, more beans, more preserved food. He reinforced the main entrance with heavier timbers and added a second interior barrier behind the outer door. A visitor might have mistaken the work for caution. It was not. It was memory. Silas remembered the storms that had nearly killed him as a boy. He remembered the numbers in Mara's ledger. He remembered how quickly comfort disappeared once the wind began moving. So while Ash Hollow Bend rebuilt for ordinary days, he kept preparing for extraordinary ones. The difference between those two ideas seemed small in spring. On the frontier, it rarely stayed small for long. By late morning on January 19, 1884, the blue line had grown. Silas Rourke stood on the rise and watched it spread across the northwestern horizon. It was no longer easy to dismiss. The color deepened with every passing minute. Not a cloud, not fog, not snow. A moving mass of Arctic air, the kind that could turn a pleasant winter day into a disaster before supper. Below the hill, Ash Hollow Bend continued with its routine. Wagons moved along muddy roads. Farmers checked livestock. Children laughed outside the schoolhouse. Nobody seemed alarmed, except Silas. He turned away from the horizon and walked toward the fortress. Mara met him near the entrance. One look at his face was enough. She did not ask unnecessary questions. "Both stoves," he said. She nodded. "Bring food up from the cellar." Another nod. "Fill every water barrel." Without another word, the household moved. Mara disappeared toward the storage room. Eli carried buckets from the well as fast as he could manage. Anna began stacking blankets beside the main room and gathering extra lamp oil from the shelves. No one rushed. No one panicked. That was not how the Rourkes prepared. Outside, the prairie still looked peaceful. Sunlight reflected off patches of snow. The wind remained light. The day felt almost warm, yet the blue wall kept growing. And with every mile it advanced, the fortress became less a home and more what Silas had always intended it to be. A refuge. The town simply did not know it yet. By early afternoon, the prairie changed its mind. The warmth vanished first. One cold gust swept across the open land, followed by another even colder than the first. Then the wind shifted. South became north. Calm became violence. The blue wall reached Ash Hollow Bend, and the world disappeared. Snow did not fall from the sky. It exploded from the ground. Loose drifts lifted into the air and raced across the prairie in solid sheets of white. Within minutes, fences vanished. Wagon tracks vanished. Entire buildings faded behind curtains of blowing snow. Visibility collapsed. A man could barely see beyond his own outstretched hand. At the schoolhouse near the southern edge of town, Miss Clara Whitcomb, a 26-year-old schoolteacher responsible for 18 children, heard the storm arrive before she fully understood what was happening. The wind struck the building like a freight train. The walls shuddered. The windows rattled violently inside their frames. Several younger children jumped at the sound. Clara immediately closed the shutters and fed more wood into the stove. The iron box glowed red. Yet the room continued growing colder. That frightened her more than the noise. The schoolhouse had always leaked heat, but never like this. The wind found every crack, every seam, every weakness. A sharp whistling sound moved through the room as if invisible fingers were searching the walls. Outside, the storm roared. Inside, the stove fought a battle it could not win. The children gathered closer together. Coats, scarves, blankets, anything that could trap warmth. Still, the temperature fell. Then came a sound Clara would remember for the rest of her life. A long wooden groan, followed by a sharp crack. One of the walls shifted slightly under the pressure of the wind. The building was still standing, for the moment, but suddenly it no longer felt safe. Clara looked at the frightened faces surrounding her. 18 children, 18 families trusting her judgment. The storm hammered the schoolhouse again. The stove glowed. The walls creaked. And for the first time that day, Clara Whitcomb realized the building might not survive the afternoon. She had just realized the grim truth. But a short distance away, through the white wall of the storm, Silas Rourke had already foreseen it all. The decision came before the schoolhouse failed. Silas had watched storms long enough to know the difference between danger and disaster. This was disaster. He left the fortress carrying a coil of hemp rope across one shoulder and several shorter rawhide lines looped around his waist. Dusty followed behind him, head lowered against the strengthening wind. By the time they reached town, the storm was already swallowing buildings one by one. The schoolhouse appeared only when he was nearly on top of it. Inside, the children sat clustered around the stove. The room was colder than it should have been. The walls spoke constantly now. Groans, creaks, sharp cracks hidden beneath the roar outside. Clara Whitcomb looked up as the door burst open. Snow rushed into the room. For a moment nobody moved. Then Silas stepped inside. "We leave now." The teacher stared at him. "Through this? The building won't hold." The answer arrived without emotion, just certainty. Outside, the storm hammered the walls again. Another long creak rolled through the structure. Clara knew he was right. The problem was getting 18 children across a prairie they could no longer see. Silas dropped the coil onto the floor. The hemp rope unwound across the room. "We stay connected." The children watched silently. Some looked frightened. Some already understood. The older students helped as Silas moved down the line. Each child was paired with another, older with younger, stronger with smaller. Short rawhide tethers connected each pair to the main rope. One line, one chain, one chance. Clara moved from child to child, tightening knots and checking gloves while Silas worked toward the front. Dusty waited outside the door, barely visible through the blowing white. He seemed less concerned than the humans. When the last knot was secured, Silas wrapped the leading end of the rope around his own waist. Clara took the final section and tied it around hers. For a few seconds, the room fell completely silent. Only the wind spoke. Silas looked down the line. 18 children. Listen carefully, he said. No one lets go. The words were simple, short enough for every child to remember, strong enough to matter. Silas opened the door. The white world rushed forward. Then the line stepped into it together. The storm erased the world. Only wind and white. Silas leaned forward and pushed against it one step at a time. The hemp line stretched behind him through the swirling snow. Somewhere farther back, Clara guided the rear of the chain while 18 children fought to keep moving. Then the rope suddenly tightened. The line stopped. Silas turned. A small figure had fallen. Jonah Bell, the 7-year-old son of widow Ruth Bell. Clara and 2 older students tried to help him stand, but his legs refused to cooperate. The cold had taken too much from him. For a moment, nobody moved. The wind howled around them. Snow raced past their faces. Silas fought his way back along the rope. When he reached the boy, Jonah was still trying to rise. Still trying, still failing. Silas looked toward Dusty, then toward the children. There was no time to think. He placed the mule's lead rope into the hands of the oldest student. Keep moving. The boy nodded. Silas bent down and lifted Jonah onto his shoulders. The child's arms wrapped weakly around his neck. Then the line began moving again. One step, then another. The wind struck. The rope tightened. The storm pushed back. Still, they moved forward. Jonah remained on Silas's shoulders. The children remained on the rope, and somewhere ahead, hidden beyond the white wall of snow, stood the only place on the prairie built for a day like this. The fortress appeared without warning. Silas reached the door first. His shoulders struck the heavy timber, and the door swung inward. Warm air spilled into the blizzard. Not hot, just warm enough to feel unreal after the last hour. Inside, lantern light flickered against thick sod walls. Mara was already waiting. So were Eli and Anna. The children entered one by one. Some stumbled, some cried. Most were too cold to speak. Clara helped guide them inside, while Mara moved immediately to work. Frozen coats came off first, then scarves and gloves stiff with ice. Blankets appeared from every corner of the room. Buckets of warm water waited beside the stoves. Steam rose into the still air. Anna carried cups from child to child with both hands. Eli fed wood into the fireboxes and checked the inner door whenever the wind rattled the outer one. The fortress absorbed the chaos. The thick walls did exactly what they had been built to do. They stopped the movement. Outside, the blizzard screamed across the prairie. Inside, the air barely stirred. Jonah Bell was lowered gently onto a blanket near the stove. Color slowly returned to his cheeks. Across the room, children who had expected to die inside a collapsing schoolhouse now sat wrapped in warmth, holding cups between trembling hands. The room felt crowded, loud, alive. 18 students, 1 exhausted teacher, all of them safe. For the first time that day, Clara Whitcomb allowed herself a long breath. The crisis at the schoolhouse was over, but Silas was already looking toward the door. The storm still raged beyond the walls. The town remained outside, and Ash Hollow Bend was full of people living in houses never designed for what had just arrived. He had brought 18 children home. The blizzard was telling him that more would follow. Silas stayed inside the fortress for less than 10 minutes. Then he reached for the rope again. The blizzard had not weakened. If anything, it had grown worse. Snow struck the walls with a sound like handfuls of gravel thrown against a barn door. Every gust tested the structure. Every gust searched for weakness. The fortress held. The town did not. Silas stepped back into the storm. This time he followed a route he had prepared years earlier. Short guidelines connected key points around the hill. Fence posts had been driven deeper than necessary. Landmarks invisible to others remained fixed in his memory. The first person he found was Ruth Bell. The young widow had barricaded herself inside a small frame house with her 2 daughters. Snow pushed through cracks around the door. The stove was still burning, but the room was losing the fight. When Ruth opened the door and saw Silas standing in the white darkness, she did not argue. She gathered her children and followed the rope. The next trip led him toward the blacksmith shop. There he found Asa Pike, the old blacksmith whose hands had shaped horseshoes, wagon tires, and plow blades for half the settlement. Part of the roof was already gone. Wind blew directly through the building. Asa stood beside his anvil, wearing 3 coats and still shivering. The old man took one look at the storm outside, then one look at Silas. That was enough. The third trip reached the center of town. The fourth stretched beyond it. The fifth carried him to the home of Caleb Voss. His confidence had vanished. One window was gone. A section of wall had begun to pull apart under the pressure of the wind. Caleb's wife sat with blankets wrapped around two terrified children. No one mentioned old arguments. The storm had made such things irrelevant. Silas handed Caleb a section of rope. Stay connected. Trip after trip. The line moved through the white emptiness. Families, children, elderly settlers. Anyone willing to leave. Anyone willing to trust. By midnight, the grass fortress held 50 people. The main room was crowded shoulder to shoulder. The livestock shelter was full. The root cellar stood open. Potatoes, beans, preserved vegetables. Everything stored for years of hardship now fed a community. Both stoves burned steadily. Not roaring, not wasting fuel. Just producing the quiet, controlled heat the fortress had been designed to hold. Outside, the blizzard ruled the prairie. Inside, 50 lives continued. And among them sat men and women who had once laughed whenever someone said the words, "Rourke's grave." Morning arrived quietly. Not because the storm had shown mercy, because it had finished. The wind that had screamed across the prairie all night faded into silence. Snow still drifted through the air, but the violence was gone. For the first time in hours, people inside the fortress could hear something other than weather. No one rushed for the door. Many were afraid of what waited outside. Eventually, Silas lifted the latch. The heavy timber swung open. Cold air entered. Sunlight followed. One by one, the people of Ash Hollow Bend stepped onto the hill and stopped. The prairie looked as if a giant hand had swept across it during the night. The schoolhouse was gone. Not entirely. Part of one wall still stood above the snow, but the roof had collapsed inward. Broken boards lay scattered across the drifted ground. The building that had sheltered 18 children the day before had lost its battle before sunrise. Farther down the slope, several homes showed the same wounds. Missing roofs, collapsed sheds, doors torn from hinges, windows shattered. Snow piled deep inside rooms where families had once slept. Near the center of town stood Caleb Voss's general store, or what remained of it. The front wall had failed during the night. Lumber, barrels, and supplies lay buried beneath wind-packed drifts. The proud building that had served as the settlement's gathering place looked like a wreck abandoned after a flood. No one spoke for several moments. There was nothing left to argue about. The evidence stood in plain sight. Then people turned toward the hill, toward the fortress. The thick sod walls remained exactly where they had stood the day before. The roof was intact. The doors held, the chimneys stood straight. Even the livestock shelter remained secure. 50 people had spent the night inside. 50 people walked back into the daylight, every one of them alive. Miss Clara Whitcomb looked from the shattered remains of the schoolhouse to the fortress. Caleb Voss stared at the wreckage of his store, then turned his eyes to the fortress. Across the prairie, nature had delivered its verdict. It had not spoken. It had simply tested every wall, every roof, every assumption, and every decision, and now the judgment stood before the entire town to see. 3 days later, the people of Ash Hollow Bend gathered inside the grass fortress. There was no other building large enough, no other building still standing strong enough. For a while, nobody spoke. Then Caleb Voss stood. The merchant looked toward Silas. "I called this place a grave." The room remained silent. "When the storm came, it saved my family. That was all." A moment later, Mayor Amos Treadwell rose from his chair. "I was wrong. No excuses followed, no defense, only the truth." Then Clara Whitcomb stood. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the rope hanging near the door. "Hope was not enough," she said. "The walls were." Several people lowered their heads. Others nodded quietly. The storm had already settled every argument. At last, attention turned toward Silas Rourke. He remained seated for a moment before standing. As always, he appeared uncomfortable being the center of attention. His gaze moved across the room, toward Mara, then Eli, then Anna. This place wasn't built by one person. His hand rested against the nearest wall. Mara kept records when nobody cared about numbers. Mara's notebook sat on a nearby shelf, filled with temperatures, fuel counts, wind notes, evidence gathered one day at a time. Silas looked toward his son. Eli carried water until his shoulders hurt. Then toward Anna. Anna gathered grass when most children were playing. Neither child smiled. Neither seemed to know what to do with the attention. Silas continued. Thousands of sod blocks. Thousands. His eyes moved toward the wall again. Nobody builds something like this alone. The room listened. No one shifted. No one looked away. Then came the sentence people would remember long after the fortress itself was gone. Build for the worst day. A brief pause followed, not the average one. The words settled into the room like another layer of sod upon a wall. Simple, practical, impossible to misunderstand. 2 years later, visitors noticed changes throughout Ash Hollow Bend. New homes appeared with thicker walls. Root cellars reached deeper into the ground. Doors gained additional wind barriers. Guide ropes connected houses to livestock sheds. Builders copied ventilation ideas. Farmers copied storage plans. Families copied preparation habits. Nobody called those features strange anymore. People simply called them sensible. Some settlers even gave the approach a name: the Rourke Wall. Years passed. Children grew up. Buildings changed. Storms came and went. But the lesson survived. The joke died first. Nobody called the fortress Rourke's Grave anymore. That name disappeared beneath the weight of experience. The rope remained. The notebook remained. The memory remained. And whenever winter gathered itself along the distant horizon, the people of Ash Hollow Bend remembered the day nature had delivered its judgment, not with words, not with anger, but with wind, and the walls that held,